Welcome to Good Grief Mama. I'm Allie, wife and mom of 3, and this is a podcast for honest conversations about motherhood and marriage and homeschooling and homemaking. So if you've ever felt called to do motherhood and marriage just a little differently, or if you've ever wondered, why is no one talking about this? Then you're in the right place, and I'm so glad you're here. This episode is sponsored by Restore Your Core Physical Therapy. Mamas, whether you're pregnant, postpartum, or your kids are in college, your body deserves some TLC. The doctors at Restore Your Core Physical Therapy get it. From pelvic floor therapy and birth prep to fixing that back pain that you've been ignoring for way too long, they've got you covered. With locations in Carmel, West Carmel, Zionsville, and Greenwood, expert care is close by. Visit restoreyourcorept.com or call 317-597-6323. Make sure you mention the Good Grief Mama podcast for $50 off a 90-minute evaluation or $25 off a 60-minute evaluation. You've been taking care of everyone else, and now it's your turn. All right. Welcome back, Good Grief Mama listeners. So before I jump into what I'm talking about today, I have just got to say, I am not a slick back ponytail or slick back bun kind of person. I've always known this deep down, but then I'll see people that I know or people on social media or whatever who have a slick back bun or ponytail. I'm like, man, they look so cute. It looks so good. And then I try it like today and it just looked like a man. And it's like, I am 100% a person who needs hair in order to look feminine. So anyway, so enjoy the slick back ponytail. I'm actually doing it because I have an oil treatment in my hair. And I was like, oh, it'll just look really cute. Anyway, but this week I'm actually talking about birth. And I'm doing that because next week I'm going to have an interview with one of my friends who had a home birth. She's had a few home births. So that interview is coming out next week. So this week I wanted to talk about, because this is a podcast that talks about doing things just a little bit differently or, against the mainstream, if you will. But I wanted to talk about why it seems that, or when we started thinking more about birth as like a medical event rather than just a normal process. And when I say we, I mean me too, like 100%. When did it become a thing where like we need all of these medical interventions and all these things that because we're going to have a problem in this pregnancy, rather than our baseline assumption being that this is a normal process that we might have, some kind of problems with. We might need some medical intervention with, but by and large, this is a normal process that our bodies were made to do. So that's what's been tinkering around in my mind lately, is just how medicalized birth has become. Somewhere along the way, birth went from something that women's bodies were designed to do to something that we feel like we need to manage and control and fix. And I want to be clear, this is not an episode that is shaming anyone's birth story. Birth is personal to each person, and sometimes interventions save lives. Sometimes C-sections are needed and absolutely necessary. But I think that we should have an honest conversation about why has our default shifted so far towards intervention, even for low risk normal pregnancies. We even call it low risk. I just thought about that now. It's like we have like high risk and low risk, and like even we call it low risk, not just like a normal process. Like this is just a normal pregnancy. So I was looking up, Indiana specifically has a pretty high C-section rate. It is 32.4% is the most recent stats on that, which means 3 out of every 10 births are C-section, which is about similar. It's a little bit higher, I believe, than our like the whole country. I think the whole country is like 31% C-section rate, which is much higher than many northern like European countries that those other countries emphasize midwifery. They emphasize physiological birth support. They emphasize fewer interventions for low risk pregnancies. And the countries that have that more widespread access to midwives, to continuous labor support, to mobility in labor, moving around in labor to patients with the physiological labor progress, that is directly correlated to lower C section rates and higher unmedicated birth rates. So, really, what I'm thinking through is just when did birth become a medical problem? Historically, birth is viewed like a normal life event, even though dangerous situations have always existed with things. And modern medicine has done incredible things. There are babies that wouldn't have never been saved without modern medicine. There are moms who would have never survived without modern medicine. I am not discounting that. But interestingly enough, the US, even though it has access to quote unquote world class medical technology and hospitals, our maternal outcome rates are worse than most other wealthy nations. We have a maternal mortality rate of 17 to 22 births or deaths, sorry, per 100,000 live births, which is much higher than other wealthy countries like ours. And yet we have all this access to these fancy doctors and hospitals. So, somewhere along the way, it has become the expectation that when you're pregnant and your birth is going to need these medical interventions rather than the exception, rather than it's so nice that we have this here in case we need it to, oh, we're probably going to need this. So, yeah. So, really, just why are we treating or why are we, and again, I'm saying we, me too. Why is it that we instantly think birth and pregnancy is just a problem waiting to happen? And we've lost our ability to think like this is a normal process until proven otherwise. We have also, again, we have also become very obsessed with due dates. Our due dates are estimations. They are not expiration dates. I got very stuck in this with my third because my other two children came on their own pretty much. My second one, they quote unquote induced me, which I'll talk about later. But they were both here before 38 weeks. And so I had it stuck in my head that this estimated due date for my third child, she was going to come early. And it was just like, it did change the way that I viewed my pregnancy, the way that I felt about my pregnancy. And I even started fighting with myself towards the end of pregnancy when I went past 38 weeks to think I had to remind myself, like, this is a good thing. My baby knows what she's doing. My body knows what it's doing. And she's healthy in there. And this is good. She is getting all of the nutrients that she needs. She's getting all of the time baking in the oven that she needs. And if I hadn't been so obsessed with the due date or like the fact that she was coming early, or that she should come early like my other ones did, then I would have enjoyed my pregnancy much more and I would have felt a lot less like something was wrong. So we are very obsessed with due dates. And there is a lot of pressure around that. Like, oh, when are you going to have that baby? Are you still pregnant? And there are, people who schedule inductions for convenience because they want, a baby on a Friday or because they want a baby before holiday or they want their doctor to be on call when they have that baby or, whatever it may be. And it's like we're so stuck on a due date and like rushing this process that sometimes I think we need to kind of process like why are we so uncomfortable waiting and what does it say with our about our relationship with our bodies to like trust that it'll know when it's time for this baby to come out and your baby will know when it's time for it to come out. There's also just been this rise in constant monitoring, ultrasounds and tests and NSTs and all the kind of monitoring. Those can be very valuable tools, but I feel like they should be tools used if needed, or for the 20-week ultrasound or whatever it may be for a normal, low risk, quote unquote, pregnancy. You don't need a ton of ultrasounds. You don't need a ton of monitoring. You don't need all of those things. And in fact, in the birth process, like consistent monitoring, where they have you hooked up to the machines, actually usually leads to more interventions than intermittent monitoring. Because when you're monitoring something 24/7, you're going to see things. And not all of those things will lead to a better outcome for you. Sometimes more testing just creates more stress or more fear. For example, I had a friend who, during her pregnancy, she was a quote unquote high risk pregnancy. And so she had more ultrasounds with her second baby. And there was an ultrasound that they had, and they found what they thought might be like a cyst on her baby's ovary. And so then she was stressed about it. And the doctors were talking about like, oh, well, possibly then after she's born, she might need surgery, blah, 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 blah. And it's like they're causing all this stress and all of these things over a possibility. And then the next time she went in for an ultrasound, there was no cyst. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry that, had you never had that ultrasound, you would have never been stressed for these few weeks about something that ultimately just disappeared and handled itself. Again, I feel like I'm going to say this entire episode, so I might not continue repeating this, but like again, these things are important and necessary when needed, but not for the every run of the mill thing because sometimes more stress does lead or more testing does lead to just more stress. And then we start thinking like, oh, maybe your baby is going to be too big, even though ultrasounds can be off by 1 pound in any direction. It's like, oh, your baby is going to, just too big for you. Or, we might need to intervene just in case of this problem. Or, you know, sometimes all of this extra testing does create just more fear and doesn't necessarily turn out for a better outcome. These are tools to support our birth, not things that we're allowing or that we should allow to replace the trust in our bodies, if that makes sense. And I'm talking to myself here. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen The Business of Being Born. It's a documentary. If you haven't, you really need to see it. It is mind blowing. And it's a little bit older of a documentary, not like crazy old, but a little bit older of a documentary. And it is fascinating. But they talk about something that really stuck with me, and it's the cascade of interventions. So if you haven't seen that movie, I'm sure it's in that documentary, I'm sure it's other places too. But the cascade of interventions is essentially the idea that when you have one intervention, it is more likely and sometimes leads to more interventions, kind of like a domino effect. So, for example, like if you get induced, that induction, which generally includes Pitocin, can cause stronger contractions, which might mean you end up getting an epidural because you're in more pain than you would have been in. And then you've had this pain management, which means the epidural, it means you can't move. So you have less mobility, which means you're not going to be able to help move your baby into all the different positions to get your baby, the baby's got to go through certain changes in position to get out. And you moving your body helps them with those different shifts. So if you have an epidural, you can't move like that all the time. Less mobility might lead to more fetal distress. Fetal distress concerns might lead to more interventions, which might lead to a C-section. Now, that doesn't mean every induction leads to a C-section. That doesn't mean that every C-section was preventable. But what it does mean is that birth is a process. And if you interfere or intervene at one point, it might likely cause a domino effect and have more interventions. That's called a cascade of interventions. So, something I think is important for us to understand is, are we always informed about that domino effect? Because I don't think so. At least in my experience, I was not informed of that domino effect. I was not informed really on the physiological birth, like on what happens in birth. Until my second child, I didn't know that the baby had different movements that they had to do in order to get themselves out. I didn't know that there's different ways that you could move your body to help them do that efficiently. I had no idea. I just knew you get in a lot of pain and then you push the baby out once you get to 10 centimeters. I had no idea the in between process. And so with my first, I was watching these videos and the videos, I've mentioned this before, which there's a few different episodes you should listen to of mine. Go back and listen to my birth story episodes. I did a birth story episode for all of my children. So there's 3 of them. I also did an episode on being induced without Pitocin because with my daughter, Peyton, my middle child, they said that I should be induced. They didn't require me to be because I work with midwives. They were very good about it. But my blood pressure was rising and they were like, you should probably consider this. And so I did, but I didn't use Pitocin. And anyway, but I was watching these birth videos when I was pregnant with my first child. And I had no idea about anything. I'm thinking, birth is a medical process and I'm going to need a hospital. I need a doctor. I need all these things. And I'm watching these videos and they show you in this hospital birth class, they show you a couple of epidural births. And in those 2 epidural births, these chicks, they looked great. They were napping and then the nurse would come in and she'd be like, hey, you're 10 centimeters now. It's time to push. And, then there's push for a couple of seconds. And then out comes this baby. And then they show one natural birth. And this lady is screaming and moaning and like it does not look beautiful. And, at the end of that class, I like walked out and I said, Nathan, I want to be the girl that's napping. Like, I want to be that girl. Like, give me an epidural. I had it listed like 3 different times on my birth plan. Get me an epidural. And that's all fine and dandy. Have your epidural. But what I am saying is I didn't know that having an epidural might lead to more interventions. I had no clue that, I wasn't really going to be able to push in a very good position. I wasn't going to be able to move to help my baby progress. I didn't know that. And had I known that, I probably still would have had the epidural for my first, but I would have at least been aware of what I could have possibly been causing. The cascade of interventions that I was stepping into, I had no clue about any of that. So, are we unknowingly intervening, which then causes a problem, which then causes more interventions for us? And then we end up saying, oh, it had to happen. Or the doctors tell us, like, oh, it was just going to happen this way. And sometimes that statement is 100% true. I will admit that. Sometimes whatever your birth it was, but sometimes also it might not have been true. Like, had we not intervened, then maybe our bodies would have waited until they were ready, and then we wouldn't have had to have so many interventions, whatever those interventions might have been. With my birth with Paxton, I know now what my labors look like. And I know that my intervening with an epidural caused a cascade of interventions that I could have avoided if I didn't get the epidural. In particular, a longer labor. In particular, a longer pushing time. In particular, blood pressure medicine. Because when they gave me an epidural, my blood pressure tanked and I ended up having to have oxygen. And I was not the girl that was napping. I was very sad about that. The epidural only took on half my body. So they were like rotating me, trying to get it to take to the other side. But then when they would rotate me to one side, the other side would go unnumb. Like it wouldn't be numb anymore. And then they'd be like, okay, let's roll you back to the other side. And then, that side would go numb, but then the other side was not numb anymore again. And then they sat me straight up and everything went not numb. It's like, not only can I not move, but now I'm in a lot of pain and I can't move. So because I got the epidural, I ended up needing to be on oxygen and have some medicine. I don't even know what they gave me because my blood pressure was just too low. And then my labor lasted longer. My labor with Paxton lasted like 9 or 10 hours. I think it was 9 hours. And then I had to push for 45 minutes. So I know now that my labors are not that long. My water broke with Pax, and that's when I like officially started my labor with him is what I'm considering. And when I got to the hospital, by the time I got the epidural, which again, remind you, I had on there 3 different places that I wanted an epidural. So right when I checked in, I was only 3 centimeters, but I was in a decent amount of pain because my water broke. And that for me, that's when my contractions get painful. And I know now, had I just let it ride, I probably would have been giving birth only a few hours after getting there. Because by the time that I got an epidural, which was very quickly after I got in there, they gave me an IV of fluids and the doctor came. I mean, it was like an hour maybe. And by the time that doctor was there, I was 7 centimeters already. So like, I know now that had I not done the epidural, I probably would have given birth very quickly after that. But because I got the epidural, then I had to have all those other interventions. And then my labor lasted longer. And I do believe even towards the end, they started telling me like that he started having some distress. And it was probably because I was pushing for 45 minutes. But all that to say, are we sometimes causing the problems that we're experiencing because we're intervening? And sometimes, again, those interventions are definitely necessary. But are we fully aware of what that cascade of interventions looks like? And are we making informed decisions? Because you very well may make an informed decision and need whatever intervention it is that you're choosing, or you just want it. You know what I mean? I wanted an epidural. Like, um, I'm not saying hate on the epidural. I'm just saying be aware of the cascade of interventions that you're stepping into when you do that. So, another thing that I started thinking about is in general, women's bodies nowadays, we've kind of lost our trust in our bodies. We've lost our connection to our bodies and understanding and trusting our bodies. Oftentimes, we view our bodies as unreliable, or our bodies are viewed as unreliable. Like if you go into labor and you go to the hospital, and it stalls for a little bit. They may tell you your body's not progressing fast enough. What fast enough for what? Fast enough because we've rushed this and now I'm in the hospital and you have a timeline, like because you don't want me in here for 48 hours laboring, fast enough for who? There are very few like hard and fast rules. I mean, I thought it was a rule, and maybe it is in some places, but I thought it was a rule like in hospitals where if your water breaks within 24 hours, generally you need to have the baby to lower infection risk. But even then, they just monitor you extra, or at least at the hospital I went to, they just monitor you extra and make sure you don't get an infection. But it's like I felt that the rushed way with Peyton. So my second, I told you I was induced because my blood pressure was getting higher. I did not have preeclampsia, but they were like, you might want to consider doing this. And I was already having a bunch of labor symptoms anyway, so I was like, sure, but I don't want pitocin. And so go back and listen to my episode about being induced without pitocin. They gave me Cytotec, which is something that's supposed to soften your cervix, and then I just pumped like with a breast pump, and I walked the halls a bunch. But because I went in for quote unquote induction, it was like 9:30 in the morning. I had her at time was it 10:30 at night. So I was in the hospital for a decent, like a whole day basically. But I wasn't actually in labor until like 6:30. And I felt kind of rushed. I'm like, well, all these doctors, this midwife is here and she keeps coming in and checking on me. And she was so great. Like the midwife that I had was awesome. And she did not rush me. She did not make me feel rushed, but I was kind of feeling it. I'm like, oh, I'm here and nothing is happening. And, so we kind of get into this the mindset of like, oh, our bodies aren't progressing fast enough. We also have this like weird thought of like, my baby's going to get too big. And like, we don't trust that our bodies know how big of a baby we can handle and how big of a baby we can grow. And now this is outside of the exception of medical problems that cause bigger babies or whatever it may be. There are definitely people that have very large babies, but we have this doubt in general about our body's ability to birth the baby that we've grown. And I don't know where that's come from. Birth is not a machine, with like a deadline. Like everybody is a robot and it pops out the same time. Like we use the same method for determining a due date for everybody, as if everybody ovulates at the same time, as if everybody has the same cycle. Like it's very strange to me, but we treat it very medicalized. And I think that leads to us getting confusing messages about our body and losing that connection that we have with our bodies and how we know what our bodies are doing and our babies know what they're doing. And again, I'm not talking about the exception where there's a medical exception. I'm talking about the norm. Are we teaching women anymore to listen to our intuition? I think that's something we should bring back, trusting our intuition, trusting our bodies to do the natural processes that we were literally created by God to do. So I think there's a balance. Obviously, there's a balance with everything. We don't need to reject modern medicine to reclaim our trust in our bodies. Use medicine when it's needed. It's there. It will save people's lives. I don't doubt that. I don't disagree with that. But understand the risks and benefits that come with it and learn to regain that trust in what is a natural part of what our bodies were made to do. Let that guide our decisions rather than a fear of this quote unquote medical problem that birth has become viewed as. Inform yourself on the options that you have and don't just hand off that responsibility to a doctor. Take part in this and trust your body. Ask questions. Do birth differently. Think through some things you can think through are like, okay, what are my options? So like, for example, with Peyton, when they were like, hey, your blood pressure is getting a little higher, I wasn't super concerned because I think, and I still do, that it was stress that was causing my blood pressure to go high because I am very influenced by stress. My body is. And it was stressful for me to go at 36, 37, 38 weeks pregnant every 2 weeks to a doctor's appointment with my rambunctious 3.5-year-old to get my blood pressure drawn and all the things. And so I think it was causing my blood pressure to be high. So I wasn't super concerned, but I did ask them, what are my options? What happens if I wait? What happens if I intervene? What are ways that I can intervene? And I did the research on my own as well that are the least risky, like they're interventions. Like anytime you're forcing somebody to be to go into labor before they're ready is a risk. But it's like, okay, I think maybe it's worth this risk because I don't want to go to preeclampsia. But it's like, but what are the least intervening ways of intervening in the situation? And so that's why I did a breast pump to help get contractions going, that kind of stuff. And then what evidence is there to support the recommendations that you're getting? There are some people who just instantly believe once you hit the age of 35, you're high risk. But there are people who are in their 40s having perfectly healthy pregnancies and babies. So it's like, just understand like the evidence that's supporting any of the recommendations that you're receiving. And I don't know, just get back to trusting our bodies. Again, that doesn't mean don't intervene. That doesn't mean don't get an epidural or anything. This isn't an episode, again, to shame anybody on how their birth story ended up or ends up. But it is about entering pregnancy and ultimately motherhood, feeling informed, feeling supported, feeling empowered and connected to our bodies that are growing and have grown and give life. And it is maybe about asking ourselves why we've become afraid of or hesitant about a process that our bodies were created to do. So if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. Leave me a comment or rating review anywhere that you listen. Sign up for my weekly email newsletters where I send out mom hacks and marriage questions of the week to help grow your marriage and strengthen your marriage. And come back next week for my interview with my friend about her home births. And I'll see you guys next week.